being in the world on the complexity of plant behavior. I think the title is explicit enough, but what I'm gonna do here, if I'm able to, this is first I'm going to talk a little bit about the science of plant behavior. In some sense, this is going to be a caveat more than extended presentation of the science itself. And then I'm going to justify why I want to use or why I actually use tools from complexity science to try to understand plant movements and plant behavior. Then I'm going to present a study we recently published in scientific reports. And then I'm going to make some concluding remarks. So let's start with this caveat about the science of plant behavior. This caveat is somehow methodological commitment. And it is a methodological commitment that starts with a very simple realization, which is that plants move a lot and a real lot. And that plant behavior in many cases is movement. And therefore, to understand plant behavior, we first need to have a good characterization of that movement, the features, how it evolves in time, etc. Importantly, this methodological commitment is not to say that other considerations, genetic, physiological, biomechanic, etc., are irrelevant. This is just to say that to make sense of these other considerations that are for sure important to understand plant behavior, we first have to have a good understanding of the phenomenon itself, right? Of how that movement happens. I would ask if everyone can mute because I'm kind of listening something strange and it's a little bit confusing. Thank you. So I'm I was saying that in order to make sense of these genetic, physiological, and biomechanic factors that for sure influence plant behavior, we first have to understand the phenomenon itself. And I take this to be, if not the good, at least a good scientific strategy. Once we understand the phenomenon itself, we will be able to talk about these other things. And we might even be able to talk about plant intelligence or not. We might not need it, right? But first, my methodological commitment here is try to understand the movement itself first. And this is because I don't know what is going on, but I think this is super strange. I don't know. Please, the host, help me with this.
I just ejected someone who I think was making noises.
Okay.
I'll see if that solved it.
Thank you. I'm taking this methodological commitment because I think there's a wrong strategy to approach this kind of issues. The wrong strategy is something like plants lack X, so we don't need to even study them in that way. For instance, a common argument is brains are needed for cognition. Plants have no brain, therefore no cognition in plants. I think you have to realize that first, this is a purely theoretical and bad argument. The claim that brains are needed for cognition is a theoretical claim that rules out things like artificial intelligence and other kind of possible intelligent beings that doesn't follow the same strategy as we do, right? I mean, there are for sure cognitive agents that have brains, but it is possible to think in that other organisms solve similar problems with a different strategy, right? But I think this is also a comfortable claim because you don't even need to look at behavior, right? It's a theoretical argument that is there and stops the research at that very moment. So I think a better methodological commitment is to first study behavior, and then we'll see whether it is intelligent, cognitive, or not. And by claiming this, I think I'm not making any kind of controversial claim. I'm actually going to quote Edward Tolman, who is one of the grandparents of the cognitive revolution, and sorry, he claims that a psychology cannot be explained by a physiology until one has a psychology to explain, right? It's like first we need to understand what kind of psychological events we observe, and then maybe we can explain them in terms of neurophysiology, say, right? So I'm going to paraphrase him and say a plant behavior cannot be explained by a physiology until one has a plant behavior to explain. And what I'm going to try to do here is to show a way in which we can use the tools from complexity science to have a plant behavior to explain. Um, with this methodological commitment in mind, and with this framework in which you have to expect that I'm going to focus on movement itself and I'm not going to focus in other aspects of it, let's turn to why complexity science. So first, a few general themes of what is complexity. And the best thing we can say is that there's no agreed definition of complexity in the literature. Whichever review or book or article you check usually starts saying something like, we have no common definition of what complexity is. We can talk about computational complexity, informational complexity, systemic, etc. Right? So, um, granting that, what I'm going to say, or the way I want to define complexity is as a property of some systems and some measurements of those systems. For instance, the brain is a complex system, and the time series that we get with an EEG are potentially complex as well. And more generally speaking, a complex system is going to be defined as a system that has many interdependent components that interact in a non-linear fashion and at different spatiotemporal scales. And I'm going to unpack this claim a little bit now, so don't go too crazy about that. But I want to point out that the behavior of a complex system will reflect these features when you measure it. So the behavior of a complex system is going to reflect this interdependency of the components, the nonlinear interactions, and the effect at different spatiotemporal scales. You can think about that in terms of, for instance, a soccer game. If you take a soccer game as a complex system and you see how it develops in time, you will observe that the movement of the individual players of the different teams will reflect these non-linear interactions, but the movement between the different lines of each team, like the defense, the midline, and the strikers, will reflect that, but also with the whole audience and the different emotional relationships there, right? So this is what you will find, that the behavior of a complex system will reflect these features that define them. So What I'm going to do before we introduce the paper is to try to give a non-technical, a highly non-technical example of the difference between a complex behavior and a non-complex one. So this is going to be a very toy example, even more like an illustration. But I want you to have an eye, and I will have to, on the interactions at different spatial-temporal scales and the interdependence between the components of the system. So think first on Galileo's famous experiment, and I put an asterisk there because historically speaking, it seems that it never happened. It was more of a mental experiment than a real one. But this famous experiment that he dropped two balls made of two different materials like metal and wood from Pisa's tower to try to disprove the Aristotelian way to understand the falling of the bodies, right? So, what path do you think the say the left ball of the picture will follow? I guess that you will expect something like this, right? Well, and if Galileo goes down, picks the ball again, comes up, and drops the ball exactly from the same place with all the conditions in remain the same, you will expect what? This, right? And if it happens a third time, you will expect this, right? But Galileo is a human being. You may think that a human being is not able to exactly drop the ball from the same place every time. But if it is not the same place and it's a very similar place, you will expect something like this. And if there are some crazy wind or some other aspect, you can expect something like that. But this is very strange, right? So if this example it's on target, you expect and find kind of a quite linear, and asterisk there in that because I say linear in this specific situation, a linear gravitational relation between the ball and the earth. So the effect of gravity in the earth is pretty much the same one every time, right? The ball, let's say, gets the same attraction of the earth every time. And you expect highly predictable trajectories and little variability, right? All of them seem to be kind of the same one. And actually, this is what you would find if the arrows were time series of the movement and you analyze them. This is an example of a non-complex behavior. It's a kind of a linear interactions between all the relevant components, the ball, the earth, etc. Highly predictable and little variability. Compare this, for instance, with a metalhead who takes the same route to go to work every morning. The metalhead, for instance, being me, who live in a church because I'm basically a monk, and my work being the Rodman Institute. So you expect that I would take a path similar like this, right? So do you think that the path I'm going to take will resemble the paths of the balls dropped by Galileo? Well, you probably expect that the next day, when I go to the Rodman Institute, I'm going to go like this, right? And the next day, it's going to be something like that, right? So what you see here, it seems like still is kind of a general similar path, right? General similar route, but there's a lot of variability there, right? So what you expect and find actually is in this case a non-linear trajectory due to a complex system working. So first, it is non-linear in different ways, right? It bends at different moments of the path, but also every step I take is slightly different to the previous step and to the next one, right? And there are some stable aspects there, like the Rodman Institute is hopefully always in roughly the same place, and my place is also roughly in the same place, but kind in at very different scales. You can find this non-linear influence in which each step influences the next one in a slightly different way, right? But you also find a lot more variability at different spatiotemporal scales. For instance, if you zoom in this green circle there, you see how every path is different in different ways, right? There's variance there. There's a general, let's say, turning right thing, but neither of the three paths make the turning at the same time or in the same way. Although the whole path is fairly predictable still, right? Due to the fact that the Rodman Institute is there and not in other place, you still see kind of the same shape, right? You know, you go there, turn right, turn left, and get there. But if there's all this variability, why or what makes the path predictable despite the variability? And I want to say that this is the interdependence between the components. So the effect of the position of the Rodman Institute, which is one of the relevant environmental factors here, and the layout of the city itself, being the streets where they are and not in other place, is what make that even you find different levels of variability at different scales, you still have a whole general predictability of the path. But now imagine that the next day I do this, and the day after I do this, and the day after I do even this, right? It seems like now, first, all the arrows are messed up. You can see anything there, right? But there's way more turns and changes and variability there. Let's look a little bit closer to the last three paths, right? One was like this. It seems it goes to one house, to the other house, and then to the Rodman Institute. The second one does pretty much the same, and the third one with a different path does the same too, right? So what we see here is that we have we find a more complex behavior, uh, although the goal is the same one, right? Is getting to the Rodman Institute, but now we have this whole variability here that has increased with no reason, and in that sense it feels like noise, right? It feels like something that shouldn't happen in our path. But if I tell you that in one house they have opened a manga store with a lot of figures of One Piece, and in the other store they have opened a metal store with a lot of albums by Ronnie James Dio, and you know me, you see how what seemed like noise right now is due to the interdependence of new relevant environmental factors, right? So on the one hand, the path is now more complex because there are new environmental factors that affect the behavior itself. On the other hand, given these new environmental factors, the path is still highly predictable, is stable given these new relevant environmental factors. So here you can see that you can increase the complexity of the system with new factors, with new interdependent components, while at the same time maintaining the predictability of the movement itself with regard to these components. And this subtlety is going to be important when we talk about the paper itself. But the thing is that this is a complex behavior. This is a non-linear behavior that exhibits a fair amount of variability at different spatiotemporal scale, but still is fairly predictable if you identify the factors. So what's the difference between Galileo's falling metal balls and the metal head walking to a job? It is that the latter is a goal-directed, controlled biological motion. In this case, by me, right? I control my behavior to my place, to the Rodman Institute, and I stop in these two stores in the in the in the path, right? So we can say that goal-directed, controlled biological motion is an instance of complex behavior. So as we know that complex behavior, and I'm going to repeat this one more time, as complex behavior is the product of a non-linear organization of interdependent components that exhibit some form of intrinsic variability, but at the same time remains stable at some scales. We can say that non-linearity, predictability, and complexity in general are at least three signatures of goal-directed, controlled biological motion. I have to make a caveat here. I'm not saying that these are necessary and sufficient conditions. I'm not saying either that these are the only three signatures. And I'm not saying that these signatures are exclusive of goal-directed, controlled biological movement. But I do claim that these are good indicators that what you have there is more similar to me walking to the Rodman Institute than to a stone falling. Okay? So with this in mind, this kind of non-technical thing, I'm going to move to show the experiment. I'm going a little bit late. I'm sorry about that, but I've got a little bit this concentrated by the noises. So let's see this video here. What you are going to see here is a movement of circumnutation, and I'm going to stop the video just to explain what it is. This is the video of a climbing beam in the center, as you see there, and a pole near to this is the same plant, two cameras, a central one and a lateral one, and it was recorded at the Mint Lab in 2016. So what you can see now, both in the zenithal and in the lateral cam, is that the plant is starting making some forms of revolutions, right? It's kind of an circular movement there. It might be difficult to see in Zoom, but now you will see I've cut the video a little bit, so it's not that long, but you see how the plant still moves, right? Making circles there. But now there's going to be a change of light. And after that, please look at the zenithal one and see what happens there. The pattern of movement seems to change from a circular one to a fishing-like one, right? It seems like the plant is trying to get to the pole, and it is going to actually get there now, right? So this is the kind of behavior, or at least this is the kind of movement I'm interested in. And the question we make in the article I'm going to show, it's is that is the plant controlling its movement towards the pole? In other words, is plant nutation or plant circumnutation an instance of goal-directed control biological motion as Darwin suggested? Or it is just a form of hardwired oscillation that is not affected by the pole, right? It is more like me walking, or it is more like a stone, right? So our hypothesis, given to everything we have said about complexity right now and before, our hypothesis was if nutation is a goal-directed control biological motion with respect to a pole, to a support to climb, the movement of the climbing beam must exhibit a non-linear organization that becomes more predictable and more complex when the pole is there, right? Like when the store of manga and the store of heavy metal made my movement more complex, but at the same time more predictable with respect to them. So to test this, we placed 10 pairs of climbing beam plants in two identical recording booths. You see the pictures of the booths here, that they were like cylindrical booths. The plant was at the center, the pole was 30 centimeters away, and a camera on top there, and we were controlling pretty much everything else: light, humidity, temperature, etc. So, and the only difference between the two environments, because the two plants were placed exactly at the same time too, the only difference there was that one booth had a pole and the other one didn't. This experiment was developed by Paula Silva, Rogi Holgumi, Pago Galvo, and myself, and is published in scientific reports. So what we did, once we put the two plants at the same time in each booth, we then carried out a time-lapse recording of the movement. That is, we took a picture every minute, and then we put all the pictures together in a video similar to the one I've just shown. Then we got the time series of the XY coordinates of the position of the shoot tip. What is this? Well, this is a frame of one of the videos, and the red circle there marks the shoot tip. So we were tracking the position in an XY plane, right? And then we selected the X coordinates as our data. So just one dimension of the two dimensions we have. There are mathematical reasons that allow us to do this, and we can talk about them, right? But at the end, what we have are things like our time series, like the picture here. In the first row here, you see two plants, a pair of plants, of one without pole and the other one with pole. And in the x-axis here, you have that here we have like 800, a little bit more than 800 data points. And the bottom row, same thing, the one pair, the no pole plant, the pole plant, and here we had like 450 data points. For all the plants, for all the 10 pairs, we focused on the last 600 data points, um, uh, divided in windows of 100 data points to carry out our analysis. So the first, we tested non-linearity using a measurement called normal peak acceleration, MPA. That what MPA does basically is compare this oscillatory time series here with I'm sorry, now I have to pass this with with the sinusoidal time series generated by a linear harmonic oscillator. In this comparison, the more different the two time series are, so the more different your time series is from a linear harmonic oscillator, the more non-linear is your behavior, right? So the more the value of MPA departs from one, the more non-linear is. So here we have the no pole condition in dark blue and the pole condition in light blue. What you see here is that both of them during the last 600 data points, right? The six time windows there, you see a kind of a small trend of increasing non-linearity. You go from 1.05 or so to 1.1 or 1.15. So it is a slightly non-linear organization that was expected as you basically expect that basically any biological system is going to be non-linear in some sense, right? So, but what is important here is that this non-linear organization is not affected by the presence of the pole. It's there's a little difference there, but it's not a significant difference in the pole condition. And, and another important point is that it seems that this increase in nonlinearity is non-monotonic, right? It kind of goes up and down depending on the time window there. But the thing that we were looking for, if it is a non-linear organization, it seems that yes, notation is the product of some form of non-linear organization. Then we tested the predictability of the time series with a method called sample entropy. Again, just put in a very simple way, sample entropy is an algorithm that evaluates how well we can predict vectors of size m plus 1, given that we know vectors of size m in a data set, right? And basically what you need to know here is that when sample entropy is closer to zero, the closer it is, the more predictable the time series are. The closer to two or so it is, the more random the time series are. So here, like in the previous graph, you see in the x-axis the last six windows and the values of sample entropy in the y-axis. You see that in both cases there, again, the movement of the plant becomes more predictable, and this is likely due to some form of anatomical and biomechanical issues there, right? As the plants grows, to move is more difficult, to make the whole expansion of the cycle is more difficult, and this can be influenced in both cases, both with pole and without a pole. You see a increase in the predictability. But in this case, the light blue is significantly more predictable than the dark blue. So when the pole is in the vicinity of the plant, the nonlinear organization of nutation becomes more predictable. So the environmental factor makes the movement more predictable with respect to it. And finally, we tested the complexity of the whole time series, and we use multi-scale sample entropy. That it is basically to perform sample entropy at different scales of data. These scales are like, imagine them like you have the whole data set, and that you zoom out a little bit and you only see some data points, and you zoom out more and you see less data points, and you zoom out more, and that's thing. So every of the zoom outs are a scale. We use a method called empirical mode decomposition to calculate these scales. I don't want to go through them. We can talk about it in the Q&A. So we perform multi-scale sample entropy for each window of data points in of 100 data points in 7 scales, where scale 1 is the full data, scale 2 is a little bit of zoom out, scale 3 is more, and that. So you can see the scales in the x-axis here and the value of sample entropy in the y-axis, and each of these line is one of the windows of data points there. So with multi-scale sample entropy, a more complex behavior is indicated by a more stable value of sample entropy across scales, or at least across relevant scales. What you see here, well, we found that this is the multi-scale sample entropy analysis for the no pole condition, and this is for the pole one. We found that generally the value of sample entropy is significantly different from the pole condition, but from the no pole. And what we see is that between scales 2 and 3, the value for the no pole seems to drop, while the value here remains more stable. These are important scales because an important part of the power of the signal is still in these scales. So they are still capturing some relevant aspects of the notation itself, right? So we think that this stability here, following the general interpretation of multi-scale sample entropy in the literature, indicate that when the pole is present there, the movement of the plant becomes more complex at different environmental scales. And we think that this indicates that the interdependence between the plant and the pole manifests at these different scales, not just in the whole signal, but at other temporal scales there. And as expected, the behavior is more complex with the pole there. So we think that our study shows that plant notation is the product of a nonlinear organization, which is the first measurement, that becomes more predictable, the second one, and more complex with the presence of the pole, the third one, right? Per our hypothesis, this entails that plant notation could be, and I want to say could be, I'm not claiming that we are sure it is, but it is compatible with the hypothesis that plant notation is an instance of goal-directed controlled biological motion with respect to the support to climb. But what does it mean? Well, according to The Guardian, it means that French bean plants show signs of intent, and that we could be even talking about plant sentience. And the BBC Science Focus reproduce kind of the same interpretation. I guess that the intent depends on how you describe goal directedness, but consciousness is, or sentience is, even more spooky. I think, like, this is journalism, so it's an overstatement. I would say that what our experiment shows is that a support to climb in the vicinity of the plant is an environmental factor that we have to take in account when we try to explain the mechanism of notation. Whether we describe it in terms of genetics, physiology, or intelligence, purely endogenous mechanisms don't work. If you think that there's no influence of the pole in the movement, and therefore you think that the movement is solely generated by a central pattern generator, by an internal oscillator, you are missing some point. You are missing some fundamental feature of the movement itself. generally speaking, I think that our analysis of the complexity and shows us that we need, when we try to understand plan notation, we need to understand the way in which the beam plan is able to detect the presence of a pole or of a support to climb and organize its behavior, its movement towards it. There are, whether this is a tropism, is just an stimulus response stuff, or is a more cognitive perception action loop, is something that we have to work on, that we have to think about. I tend to think that the reaction to a wavelength is not the same as detecting an object, and so I lean towards more of some form of perception action loop. But we need more work. But importantly, what our experiment points out is that, look, this environmental factor is influencing the movement, and the movement could be controlled towards it. One more thing is that, what about plant consciousness and sentience in this context? I can only say two things. The first one is, I don't know. I think nobody knows. Consciousness is spooky. And the second thing is that, in the case plan, sentience is a thing. We probably should expect that this is going to be different to our own sentience, right? We are biologically different enough as to probably expect something different. And importantly, our study says nothing about it. But if you are interested, I've just edited a plant sentience special issue in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. It should be available now, and a group of philosophers, psychologists, biologists, and plant scientists argue both in favor and against plant sentience there. So I think if you are interested in this, better than asking me, or better than looking to our paper or the paper I've presented here, you better read this. And to sum up, or something like that, I want to say that what I've tried to claim here is that we need a science of plant behavior, if only to inform plant physiologists about what the assignment is. So if they want to know what kind of behavior their physiological mechanism is carrying out, we need to understand what behavior it is, right? I think that the science of complexity provides tools to understand plant behavior, as it provides actually tools to understand biological behavior in general. And finally, we probably need way less grand claims like the impossibility of cognition without brains and blah blah blah, which are just theoretical claims, or that the plant sentience is something that we know for sure. And what we need to look is more phenomenology, more psychology, and to work more on behavior itself. And I think complexity science can help with that. And that's all. Thanks.